The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. We will start our webinar in just 2 more minutes, so we'll be prompt right at 1 o'clock. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's right at 1 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and get started on our webinar, FDA, CDC, and OSHA, a guide to changing respiratory protection regulations. My name is Michael Tessmer, and I'm the Manager of Safety Services for Conney Safety Products, your partner in safety. Our presenter today is Kady Olson. Kady Olson is a national safety consultant with over 10 years of experience in the life sciences and construction industries. She is a certified safety professional with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a master's degree in occupational safety and health. Previously, she has held roles as a safety manager at a multinational pharmaceutical company and at the Wisconsin Safety Council. Kady is one of 5 certified safety professionals and consultants we have at Conney Safety Consulting. As a handout for today's session, we have our safety services brochure to help you learn a little bit more about our dynamic team and our abilities to help customize solutions for all your safety needs at your facility. So I will be back a little later with a very unique poll question related to today's topic, and so you will not want to miss that. So with that said, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Kady.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on our webinar. Today, we are going to be discussing regulatory guidance around respiratory protection as it pertains to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as Michael mentioned, I am a safety consultant, and typically, as far as consulting goes, as it pertains to respiratory protection, most of my knowledge is around OSHA and NIOSH, and a few of you on the call probably can relate to that. Most of the time when I'm going out into a facility to do audits or help them with safety program development, we're really looking at OSHA's guidelines around the respiratory protection program. However, once the pandemic started and we started receiving calls from customers, we had a lot of questions around N95 and the role that the FDA was playing in terms of approving those specific types of respirators for use with healthcare facilities. And so I kind of had to switch gears, thinking, more with my OSHA safety hat and put on my FDA hat and look at, what the FDA really has to do with respiratory protection as it pertains to this particular pandemic. So hopefully you find this presentation useful. I know this information has helped me a ton as I'm talking to customers when they're looking for alternatives to some of the respiratory devices that they currently use or maybe were using pre-pandemic. But the overall agenda today, first, we're going to take a look at why respiratory protection is so important during this particular time. What is it about COVID-19 that requires healthcare providers to wear respiratory protection? Then we'll do a little refresher into how these three regulatory agencies actually govern respiratory protection. So it's three different parties. Everybody kind of has a hand in the pot. What are they doing? What are they saying? And what industries are they regulating? Then we're going to move on to talk about some of the strategies that the CDC has put together to help optimize the supply of PPE, knowing that there are shortages right now in the United States. And then finally, probably the most important, we're going to take a look at what the current guidance is. What are the FDA, CDC, and OSHA currently saying about what you can use to protect your employees, with the goal of really making sure that we are providing that healthy environment for our employees while, complying with the standard. And we'll follow up with some Q&A. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is the role of respiratory protection during COVID-19. And you guys have probably seen it on the news. For people who aren't really familiar with the safety industry, maybe they had never even heard of PPE before. Now it's a household name, right? People are very familiar with what that is. So what has that shortage led to? Why has that shortage come about? And what is being recommended by NIOSH? So first, let's talk about some of the things we know about COVID. So COVID-19 is part of a larger family of viruses called coronaviruses, and we've seen these before. In 2004, there was an outbreak of the SARS coronavirus, and then in 2012, there was an outbreak of MERS. And so typically, these are viruses that circulate among pigs, camels, bats, cats. For the most part, they cause mild to severe upper respiratory illnesses. Now, with this particular pandemic, we identified this strain of virus back in December 2019 with origins in the Wuhan province in China. Since that initial discovery, between late to mid December and early January to March, over 1 million people have been infected by the virus worldwide, and over 50,000 people have died. Based on my research that I got this morning, just the latest data that I have here in the United States, we have over 780,000 reported cases and over 42,000 deaths. And as you can tell, this is something that is very problematic and something that has really required all nations to work together rapidly to be able to respond to this. And just like any other pandemic, any other illness, right, the big thing that we need to worry about here is how it is being transmitted. And so when it comes to COVID-19, and really where it plays a role in terms of choosing respiratory protection, is really how it's being spread. And World Health Organization has two initial thoughts of how these things are being spread, from person to person and then airborne transmission. Now, another thing to comment on in terms of spread is something that you guys have probably heard about on the news: symptomatic versus asymptomatic spread. So it's very easy to tell if somebody has the virus, right? We know that they're coughing, shortness of breath, but there are a number of people who we've discovered are carriers of the virus that are asymptomatic, which means that if they're going out into public environments without any shielding, of their breath, it's very likely that they can pass that on to other people. And so that's where, the new guidances around face coverings have come into play. We're not going to talk so much about that. We're going to really focus kind of on the occupational standpoint from this point on. So when it comes to transmission, like I mentioned before, there are two main types that the World Health Organization is really looking into. And the first one is the person-to-person contact. This person-to-person contact really relies on the fact that anytime we cough, sneeze, speak even, we're producing these droplets of more or less water or moisture molecules, right? And these droplets, particles, can range anywhere between 5 to 10 micrometers or microns in size. And it's thought that the people who have been infected with this virus, those droplet particles also contain the virus. Also important to know when we start to talk about the virus in general and the virus size and things like that, that the virus isn't just out there kind of lurking on its own, right? It's bonded to something, and in this case, it's bonded to these droplet particles. These droplets are emitted through coughing, sneezing, speaking, as I mentioned, and can travel up to 6 feet. So if you're wondering where that social distancing of 6 feet guideline came from, it came from the studies that were showing that these droplets can travel that far. Where we see infection is that when we have somebody who is come in contact with an infected person, if those droplets enter their mouth, their nose, even through their eyes, right? Any mucosal membrane, there is a chance that it's going to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and then that virus makes its way into our lungs. And that's where it settles and where we start to experience those respiratory symptoms. Another thing, though, that we've seen with studies through the World Health Organization is that you can also contract it through contact with contaminated surfaces. So if I am doing a really lousy job of covering my cough, right, and I'm coughing all over a shared workspace, and I am contaminated or I'm infected, there is a large likelihood that I'm going to spread that infection to the surfaces. And then anybody who comes behind me and touches that and then touches their face could contract the virus, right? Other things that other ways that we think this is being transmitted, and although studies have shown this is not as likely, but is through airborne transmission. And when we talk about airborne transmission, we're really talking about aerosolization of those droplet particles, creating what the scientists are actually calling droplet nuclei particles. And those are smaller, far smaller than the droplets that I mentioned earlier, and they're about 5 microns in size. And they say that those are actually suspended in air. They've done some laboratory studies that have found that once the virus has been aerosolized, it can survive in air for up to 3 hours, and it can travel over distances greater than 6 feet. There really isn't too much data behind that, though, and again, the studies that they've performed have just been in laboratories, so we don't have really good data around how that acts in the real world. But this has really kind of driven how healthcare providers are trying to protect themselves. So if you think about aerosolization and think about some of the procedures that these healthcare providers are having to perform on these infected patients that can create or generate aerosols, things like intubation, if you're doing a tracheotomy, administration of a nebulizer treatment, even performing CPR, right? That's all aerosolizing those droplets, which makes it extremely hazardous for those healthcare workers. So why do we talk about how it's being transmitted? Why do we talk about the droplet size? Well, that really leads the way into the discussion for what type of personal protective equipment we are choosing to protect ourselves during this pandemic. And you've probably seen on the news, even people right out in public, surgical mask versus what we are calling an N95, another term which you probably never even heard about before now, but it is a commonly used household term. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between those two things. When it comes to respiratory protection here in the United States, it is governed by NIOSH. NIOSH is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and they govern how respiratory protection is tested, evaluated, and then recommended for use in the occupational setting. Surgical masks, on the other hand, are not regulated by NIOSH. They're cleared by the FDA. They are considered to be a medical device because they are used in a great deal when dealing with patients. In terms of protection level, you can see here on the slide just where we see the differences. Surgical masks are designed to protect against large droplets, splashes or sprays of bodily or other hazardous fluids. So if we're thinking, person-to-person transmission, we're thinking about these large droplets anywhere from 5 to 10 microns, it's going to do a pretty good job of protecting you against that. But where we're seeing a lot of healthcare facilities take it a step farther is having their employees wear an N95. And N95s are great because they kind of are all inclusive. It's not necessarily just those large droplets, but we're also looking at aerosols, large droplets. Think about other industries where N95s are used. It's really small particles. I come from the pharmaceutical industry where we used active pharmaceutical ingredients that were really, really small particles that could be, very dangerous if inhaled, and we use similar respiratory protection to protect against those as well. Other differences really have to do around the fit. So an N95 is really only going to do you any good if you have a tight seal. It is designed to be tight fitting, which means that if you have any type of facial hair, it's going to really impact the seal and not going to get you that good fit. So you're not going to get as much protection. Your surgical mask is designed to be loose. There's no fit test requirement for it. There's no user seal check requirement, unlike the N95, which you do have to do an annual fit test, as well as do a seal check every time you put the respirator on. Now, filtration kind of falls in line with protection of the surgical mask versus the N95. And I want to spend a minute talking about this particular characteristic of an N95. Now, if you guys are familiar with N95s and really what that nomenclature means, you know, N saying, you know, it's not oil resistant, so don't use it in an oily environment. And that 95 really means it filters out at least 95% of airborne particles in the 0.3 micron size range. Well, what does that mean? Well, the reason why we are saying 0.3 micron is OSHA, or rather NIOSH, has determined that to be the most penetrating particle size. So if you really look at anything that's outside of that size range, anything that's greater than 3 microns, best captured through impaction, interception, and gravitational setting. Anything less than 0.3 microns is best captured by diffusion or electrostatic attraction. So it's really coming down to the physical properties of these particulates and why we're choosing this particular size range to test for these NIOSH-approved respirators, because it really is, you know, the toughest range to capture. So don't let that size fool you into thinking that, you know, we're not going to be able to capture things smaller than that. This is really just what they're tested at, and that's a median, right? So it's an average of the range. Other things to be cognizant around, again, since N95 is supposed to be tight fitting, you get minimal leakage around the edges when it has been fitted to you properly. And two things that they have in common, the surgical mask and N95, is that number one, you can't share them with another person. And then number two, they are designed to be discarded after each use. And we're going to get some further guidance around that when we start to talk about some of the current guidance from the FDA, CDC, and OSHA. So now that we understand a little bit around respiratory protection, why it's necessary during this pandemic, let's do a quick refresher and look at how these three different agencies actually govern respiratory protection here in the United States. So if you're a safety professional like me, you probably are familiar already with NIOSH and their role in respiratory protection. NIOSH is a branch of the Center of Disease Control, which is a subset of the Department of Health and Human Services, which the FDA also falls under. NIOSH approves all of the respiratory protection here in the United States for use in an occupational setting through what is called the National Personal Protective Technology Lab. And this organization was established in 2001 as a request from Congress, actually. They were getting some feedback that the respiratory protection, particularly in addition to some other types of PPE, they weren't performing satisfactorily in the occupational setting. So Congress charged NIOSH to develop this testing lab so that we can make sure that everybody who is manufacturing PPE in the United States is held to be in compliance with their standards. And so that's more or less where it comes from. It addresses all types of PPE, even monitoring equipment for hazardous environments as well. But respiratory protection really is the cornerstone for this particular subset of the CDC. Once it goes through testing in this laboratory, NIOSH assigns an approval number to each model of respirator. So when a manufacturer like 3M is getting ready to release a new line of respiratory equipment, they actually send it to this lab and it gets tested to the NIOSH standards before it gets released to be used by the public. NIOSH approves the respiratory protection, but they really don't have a say in terms of how it's used or what type of program it's used in the workplace. Where we really see that is with OSHA. And again, if you're a safety professional, then you are probably intimately familiar with the OSHA respiratory protection program. So just like the CDC, OSHA is another branch of the government. It's a branch of the Department of Labor. And what we're looking at here is OSHA's 1910-134 standard that governs the use of respiratory protection within industry. The thing about that is it doesn't evaluate or approve respiratory protection. They actually defer to NIOSH for that. However, it does govern how that respiratory protection is used in the workplace. So probably familiar, but in case you're not, some of the elements of an OSHA compliant respiratory protection program includes the use of respiratory protection, the selection of what type of protection that you're going to have, a medical evaluation, maintenance, fit testing, and then how you're going to train your employees. Now, when we talk about the FDA and healthcare setting, OSHA does govern respiratory protections in healthcare, but not the devices that are used in healthcare, right? So it mandates that you have to have all of those elements of the program that I mentioned before, but it doesn't necessarily state what type of PPE needs to be used. And that comes into play when we start to talk about the FDA. So the FDA regulates what they call medical devices as they are used in the healthcare setting. And N95s, as they're used to protect healthcare employees, are also considered to be a class 2 medical device. And what that means is a medical device in the FDA requires what's called a 510K pre-market clearance, which means that the FDA is taking their own set of guidances and they're testing and they're evaluating these things. You know, if you've ever been part of a pharmaceutical company, right? You're familiar with the FDA and the requirements, the pre-market clearance that you have to go through in order to get your drugs approved. And it's pretty similar with medical devices as well. One caveat, though, is with these N95 respirators, with the FDA has decided are exempt from this 510K pre-market clearance. And the reason why they exempt it is because they defer, again, back to the CDC. So they have something that's called this memorandum of use between the FDA and CDC, and it outlines the framework for how the FDA, CDC communicate and collaborate with each other on respiratory protection. So more or less, this MOU is saying, you know, CDC and NIOSH have done all of these testings to verify that it's up to snuff per NIOSH standards. So we're going to go ahead and exempt our internal evaluation on the end of the FDA and go ahead and release these for use. And that's really how it works. Typically, though, when it comes to that pre-market clearance, FDA are using things like quality control standards. If you're familiar with good manufacturing practices or GMPs, those are the things that they're looking at and evaluating prior to giving a medical device that pre-market clearance. So now we know the three players, right? And we know how they're acting together. We know how they're playing with each other nicely in the different industries. Now let's talk a little bit more about our current situation and the shortages that we are seeing right now. The CDC recently has put together what they call strategies for optimizing supply. And they've put this together for every type of PPE that is applicable to the COVID pandemic, but we're going to specifically talk about respiratory protection right now. It was originally developed for use by federal, state, and local respiratory protection program leaders in the healthcare setting, although we'll see here shortly how we extrapolate that into other industries as well. Outside of this PPE, though, CDC is still recommending using the hierarchy of control. You know, so what engineering controls or administrative controls can we use to mitigate potential exposure? I know, for example, I have a doctor's appointment later this afternoon, and they actually called me yesterday to do some pre-screening questions to shorten the amount of time that I'm actually going to be spending in the office. So we're doing a lot of other things too that aren't necessarily just the PPE, and that's something that's really important to think about. CDC gives 3 different capacity strategies. The first is conventional capacity, and that is really just your day-to-day normal operations, how you operate, normally when there's not a pandemic, how do you issue respiratory protection, things like that. The next step up from that would be a contingency capacity. So if you're ever in a situation where you anticipate that there's going to be a shortage, how do you kind of stockpile or distribute your PPE accordingly, knowing that it's likely that there's going to be a shortage? And then finally, they have what's called the crisis capacity. And this is a situation that we're in right now where there are known shortages of these types of PPE. And so they put together the following 3 strategies for how we can optimize supplies. The first strategy that the CDC gives is using respirators outside of their manufacturer designated shelf life. So respiratory protection, whether it be disposable, reusable cartridges, whatever the case may be, they have a shelf life, considered an expiration date, right? And typically, if they are outside of that expiration, they are no longer considered to be NIOSH approved. Well, we found that we had the stockpile of respiratory protection within the United States, and we wanted to determine if there was a way that we could use that stockpile, even though some of the respiratory protection was outside of what the expiration would be, and then therefore no longer NIOSH approved. And so what the CDC did is they did a study of 11 different models that were in the stockpile that had been manufactured between 2003 and 2013. And what they found was that these products, despite being expired, were expected to provide the same level of protection as things that were within their expiration. So the models there are shown on the screen that they actually did the testing on and that are approved to be used outside of their expiration dates. If you have them and they're outside their expiry, you can still use them with a couple of caveats. Number one, just like any other type of personal protective equipment, you need to visually inspect it prior to use. Make sure that the seal is adequate. Make sure that the bindings, the strings, the straps are going to be able to withstand the work that you're going to be doing while wearing that mask. You have to inform the users that it is expired, right? So if I'm doling out these expired respirators at a hospital, I have to let the people know that are going to be wearing them that they are expired. And then finally, if during the visual inspection we've determined that we cannot perform a user seal test on these respirators, they have to be discarded immediately. Now, you're probably looking at this list and thinking, well, what if I have something that's outside of those brands or models? CDC says that in lieu of any of these models, you can use another respirator outside of their shelf life if there is no other option. So if you don't have any of these, if you don't have any ways to incorporate the next 2 strategies that we're going to talk about, then they say you can go ahead and use one of the other models of respirators outside of its expiration date, again, given those precautions that you have to take prior to actually donning or putting on the respirator. The second strategy that the CDC is allowing us to use in this shortage of respiratory protection is they are allowing us to use respirators that have been approved under other countries' standards. So of the countries that you see here, they have performance standard testing pretty much equivalent to the standard methods that NIOSH uses to test the respirators used and approved here in the United States. They are expected to provide similar levels of protection so long as proper fit is achieved. So remember, if you're giving someone a respirator that's still too big for them, we're still not going to see adequate levels of protection. So just keep that in mind. All of the respirators that you see, the performance standards and then the acceptable product classification have an assigned protection factor of at least 10 in their respective country. So it really puts them on the same level in terms of ability to protect you as the N95, and that is why NIOSH has gone ahead and given the okay to start importing these. Now, you'll probably notice on there that we have KN95s and KN100s from China listed. there was kind of a lag between when we were going to start accepting all of the other countries versus when we started accepting China. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when it comes to the current guidances, and we look at the timeline in terms of when the FDA released their emergency use authorizations for the different standards here. So if you have a question around that, just hang tight, because I promise we're going to get to it. The last strategy that the CDC provides is the limited reuse of respirators, and reuse essentially means that you're using it over again. Now, if you think back to the table I showed you earlier, the differences between the surgical mask and the N95s, you'll probably remember that I said that they were meant to be disposable after each use. Well, if we start throwing them away, then we're adding to the shortage, right? So one of the things that the CDC is allowing us to do is have a limited reuse. So really putting restrictions, though, on the number of times the same respirator can be reused. Now, CDC says that you should consult with the manufacturer's guidance. I will tell you, as someone who deals with PPE on a daily basis and manufactures a PPE, I was hard pressed to find a manufacturer that was actually going to give me the number of times a respirator can be reused, because they are meant to be disposable. CDC says if the manufacturer is not able to provide you with that data, they suggest limiting it to no more than 5 uses per device. And think of a use as you put it on and then you take it off. And then once you put it on again, that's considered to be a second use. Some other things to think about, though, when we have that limited reuse, making sure that they're not shared by multiple healthcare providers, and again, doing that pre-use inspection. If you have a respirator that is grossly contaminated or damaged, it must be disposed of immediately. CDC has actually put forth some really interesting guidelines, I think, too, with regard to this reuse. They recommend kind of distributing a minimum of 5 respirators to each employee. And then the employee is then to put one of those masks in a paper bag after each use. So if you can imagine, you have your paper bags lined up, labeled Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then at the end of the day on Monday, you put your Monday respirator back in the paper bag. And what that does is it allows for any contamination that could potentially be on the outside of that respirator to actually die within that paper bag before it's reused. The one thing you have to remember about that, though, is that it's a minimum of 72 hours between uses. And that stems from how long the virus can live on different types of surfaces. But the CDC is recommending that if you have a respirator that you've worn before, put it in a paper bag, 72 hours later, you can reuse that again, so long as you're not reusing it more than 5 times in a row. So that's what the CDC says. And now, we talked about it, and we know that there are 2 other players here that we need to be cognizant of. So how are the FDA and OSHA taking these strategies for PPE optimization and applying it to the industries that they govern? And we're going to take a look at the timeline. So really, the first temporary enforcement guidance that we got throughout this pandemic came from OSHA back on March 14th. And this was a enforcement guidance to OSHA compliance officers. And really what it said is that they were giving the compliance officers what they called enforcement discretion, that so long as healthcare providers or healthcare facilities were meeting the expectations or meeting the compliance criteria for every other aspect of their respiratory protection program, they were lessening the regulatory burden to comply with the annual fit testing requirements. So if you're familiar with OSHA's respiratory protection program, you know that if someone is using a respirator, they have to be fit tested annually with the model and size respiratory protection that they are anticipating on using in the field or during their job. Now, you can imagine in a healthcare setting during the pandemic, this fit testing was very difficult to do. I've done my fair share of managing a respiratory protection program, and scheduling those fit tests can be very difficult. And so March 14th, OSHA came out with this temporary enforcement guidance that really kind of lessened the regulatory burden for those fit tests only for healthcare facilities. All right. Now, the next piece of guidance that we got was from the FDA. And this is where I really had to start digging and looking into really, what did the FDA have to do with respiratory protection anyway? So on March 28th, we got notification that the FDA was going to allow the import or use of imported non-NIOSH-approved disposable filtering face pieces. So this meant that we were able to import all of those other models that I showed you in that table, with the exception of models that were manufactured and tested in China, right? So FDA issued this through what they called an emergency use authorization. And they said that at that point we could, get things from Mexico, from Australia, from New Zealand, all of the other countries listed in that table, but not China. So that really did open up and expand the amount of PPE or the different types of PPE that we were able to get into the United States for our healthcare workers to use. The very next day, again, to address the shortage that we had, was another emergency use authorization from the FDA regarding how we could go about decontaminating our mask. Now, N95s, like I mentioned before, meant to be disposable, right? Not meant for reuse. However, there is a laboratory in Ohio that utilizes what's called the Battelle system. And it's a system that's used to decontaminate other types of medical equipment. And FDA actually gave permission on March 29th to be able to use those. So we actually had hospitals that were sending contaminated masks to this facility. They were using that Battelle system to decontaminate the masks so that they could be reissued to the hospitals contamination free. So again, kind of helped us a little bit in terms of the PPE that we had available to us. The next guidance that we got was from OSHA, and actually within the same day, OSHA gave us two different guidance documents that really kind of helped and expand on some of the requirements outside of the healthcare industry. So really everything that we've gotten from with either FDA or OSHA up until that point had really been around the healthcare industry. And so now we're seeing on April 3rd that OSHA is actually adopting those CDC strategies, all three of them, for use in all industries. So what does that mean? So if I am a construction worker and I'm utilizing respiratory protection to protect my employees against silica, right? Normally I would be using that N95, but if I have a shortage of them, okay, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna refer to those three strategies from the CDC. So it really helped us out from a non-healthcare setting, right? So not only are we looking at, different options for people who are working with infected patients, but we're also thinking about those employees who maybe aren't working in a healthcare setting, but are still relying on respiratory protection to protect them from day-to-day hazards that they are affected by in their jobs. So again, allowing for the extended use or reuse, and then also expired. And then later that day, they opened it up to say, all right, now we're going to allow the use of respirators that have been certified under other countries' standards for use across all settings. Again, that day, April 3rd, was a pretty busy day for the regulatory agencies. So later that day on April 3rd, FDA went and issued an announcement as it pertains to respiratory protection that had been manufactured and certified in China. So they expanded it to allow for the import of the KN95 mask with approval from the FDA. So what that means is if I'm an importer of respiratory protection and I want to import a shipment of KN95 mask, I need to gather as much information as possible from the manufacturer of those masks and submit it to the FDA for written approval prior to placing the order. And to expedite that, the FDA actually created an email address very specific to this purpose. And so the intention there is to have a very quick turnaround time in order to get these KN95 masks that have been approved into the country. The next guidance that we saw, again from OSHA, opened things up a little bit more and expanded beyond the healthcare industry. So if you think back to that first guidance that we got from OSHA, it was lessening that regulatory burden when it came to healthcare industries. But on April 8th, OSHA issued another temporary enforcement guidance that gave that same type of enforcement discretion to their compliance officers as it pertained to all industries. So lessening the regulatory burden for annual fit testing requirements, so long as all other criteria of the regulatory program are being met. We also started to see, and even on our end here at Conney, as someone who sells this material, a shortage of the fit test supplies. So if you've ever been fit tested before or have administered a fit test, you know that there's things like bit tracks and other supplies that we use in order to administer that fit test, and those supplies are short right now, and OSHA realized that. So they gave us some guidance around how we can work around that as well. So if you are short in terms of the supplies that you need to do fit testing, they're saying prioritize the fit test for people who are going to be working in the most high hazard procedure depending on your industry. And then finally, if you remember, I mentioned a requirement of the fit test is that so whoever is going to be fit tested needs to be tested with the model and size that they're going to be using on a day-to-day basis. Well, given the shortage, OSHA says that if that size and model that the employee was originally fit tested is not available, as the employer or respiratory protection program manager, you can work with the manufacturer to identify a similar model with no regulatory repercussions. So again, kind of giving us a little bit more leniency around how we can maintain compliance and then help our employees during this time where we have this PPE shortage. And then last week, we also got some feedback from the FDA. In addition to using that Patel system I mentioned earlier, they also are approving the use of a product from Advanced Sterilization Products, the SteriAd sterilizing unit, which uses vaporized hydrogen peroxide to decontaminate N95 masks. And what's really great about this is that about 900 hospitals throughout the country already have these units. So it's just giving us another way to, decontaminate and kind of extend the use life of the respirators that we have. So it took some time to get here. And as you can see, there were some back and forths. OSHA kind of lagged a little bit in terms of, implementing the CDC guidelines versus when the FDA did. But fortunately, right now, it appears that all agencies are on the same page with regards to the guidance that they have. One thing to note, though, is that these guidances are temporary and they are subject to change readily during the course of this pandemic. So don't get too attached to these because they could very well change as we speak. The most important thing to do that has been really helpful for me is if you go to OSHA, FDA, or CDC, you can actually sign up for updates for these guidances that are coming out so that you are up to date on all of the information that you need to have. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. I know researching this and getting involved in the FDA requirements was a challenge for me right off the bat, but hopefully you find this valuable. Right now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Tesmar. Michael, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Kady. That was a very informative update on, talking about the regulatory agencies, how they mesh, and how it affects us all in the workplace. So I appreciate that. One thing that came to mind as you were doing this, one of the slides you had, you were talking about the comparison of surgical masks and the N95s, and it makes me think about the times I've had to recently go to the grocery store, and I know hopefully everybody can relate to this. We see people wearing different varieties of masks. We have our homemade masks, we see surgical masks, and we do see N95s. And what's interesting is I've been seeing more and more people wearing N95s with exhalation valves in them. And so think about it, an exhalation valve, it's really a great concept when you think about it for a disposable respirator when used in a factory environment, because it's designed, what does it do? It gets rid of your hot, humid breath very quickly, because with a traditional N95 respirator, we are inhaling through the filter media as well as exhaling, and we all know what can happen. It gets very hot, wet, and sticky inside the mask, and and that's why people don't want to wear them for very long, and that's one of the problems with it. But the problem with these masks with the valve in it is, as you can imagine, if you have somebody that's potentially asymptomatic with COVID-19 as an example, and you're wearing one of these masks out in public, your exhaled breath is coming right out the valve. It's not being filtered out. And so whether, as Kady had mentioned, whether you're coughing, whether you're sneezing or clearing your throat, whatever, even talking, a lot of that spit and all the droplets are coming right out that valve and out into the public. So I just want to warn people about that is a concern. And one could even argue that the homemade mask that the CDC was talking about and wearing a facial covering, you know, we've seen people take their turtlenecks and pull it up over their nose and their mouth, and I could argue that is at least doing something better at protecting the public around you when you are in a public place and maybe in close proximity, to keep that those little droplets from coming out of your mouth. And so that's my comment, I guess, but I thought that was a very good presentation. And, you know, before we go to this poll question that I was talking about earlier, I wanted to encourage, I know we're starting to get a few questions coming in, and I want to encourage now, because we're going to go to some questions and answers here shortly, and we've got a bunch of questions coming in that Kady can answer. So feel free to go ahead and pose your question. But we're going to go to a poll question. So if we could get that pulled up here. And it's kind of interesting, and I want to expound on this a little bit more. So, you know, due to the constraints of GoToWebinar, we're kind of limited to how much we can say in our questions, and I can get kind of wordy with this, but I want to kind of, before you just quickly answer this, I want to kind of go into a little more detail with this. So what's your biggest concern as employees come back to work after this pandemic event? Even if you're an essential business operating right now. So think about it that way. Even if you're operating right now as a business, what's your biggest concern as we start to see people coming back in more full force back into the workplace? So number one, just to kind of give a little more detail, making sure we have appropriate PPE supplies to safely run our operation at full capacity. So that would be question A. Question B, retraining or refresher training of workers on basic safety requirements for their job, and the fear of potentially maybe excessive injuries due to extended downtime. So letter B might have more to do with is, are you as a manager or a safety professional, are you worried about maybe excessive injuries occurring as people coming back, and how do I handle the training? Letter C, dealing with employee fears and anxieties when returning to work. Could that be affecting production? And could managers be worried about that? Could we have a slowdown? Could it take a while to get things ramped up? And then letter D, how do we maintain social distancing protocols when employees return? You know, we do have to realize there's still going to be a possibility that we could have small outbreaks. I mean, it's probably inevitable. And so go ahead and take a few seconds to answer that question. But think about what's occurring right now. I think everybody's probably heard on the news about the pork plant shutting down. We just had another one, I think, in Minnesota that just came into play. Kady, I'm sure you've heard about it as well. I think I've heard as much as the closures have meant as much as 10% of the U.S. hog slaughtering capacity is down. So it's a big deal. And I think we have to realize that every facility is a little bit different with this whole social distancing thing, and you know, we know there are factories out there where people are stacked up side by side, and we're going to have to kind of think that through going forward, how we're going to deal with that. Okay, so hopefully our poll will wrap up here in a second, and we will see the results of that. As that's coming up, I just want to make note also, you know, for those that had signed up for this webinar, we have another webinar coming up here on Thursday. So I want to make sure that everybody remembers that Thursday at 1 o'clock. If you have an employee in your facility that tests positive for COVID-19, now what? So, you know, as this whole situation evolves, many employers are asking, how do we mitigate the risk of contamination in the workplace? And what best practices are needed to control the spread? So very exciting to have that webinar coming up here on Thursday at 1 o'clock. Okay, So the answers to the poll, this is exciting because I had no idea how this would come up, and this is what we got for our group. So thank you all for responding. It looks like at a close win is ensure we have appropriate PPE to safely run our operation at 35%. Coming in second is dealing with employees' fears and anxieties when we come back to work at 32%. How do we maintain social distancing protocols at 28%? And then the last concern is the retraining of the workers at 6%. So that's very interesting because I really wasn't sure how that was going to turn out. But that will lead us then, to our next slide. And I see we got some more questions coming in. Look at this. So we are looking with our teams here at Conney and Hazmasters. We're looking at having another webinar coming up in the very near future, possibly maybe as early as next week or the week after, the new normal, returning to work post-COVID-19. So let me mention, over the next few weeks, we've already heard about many businesses will be returning to pre-pandemic operations. So do you have the policies in place to ensure the health and safety of your employees when they return to work? From addressing employee anxieties to securing necessary safety supplies, there are sure to be many new challenges for employees during this time. So we all know that a little preparation can help you welcome your employees back to work safely. So that's exactly what we are planning to do with this next webinar. So I really hope you mark that on your calendar. You'll see some email references to that coming up here soon. So with that said, I'm going to turn this back over to Kady. Kady, I see you got a bunch of questions here. If you could start on a couple of these questions that have come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm seeing a lot of questions right now regarding having a fit test program in place. So if you are implementing the use of a face mask or a respirator solely as a response to the pandemic, that means that you don't normally have a respiratory protection program in place. And so long as you only are doing that in response to the pandemic, the requirements for the program don't apply. However, if you are using these strategies from the CDC to supplement some of the respiratory protection devices that you already have as part of your existing respiratory protection program, yes, same rules apply. You have to have the annual fit testing requirement. They should have been fit tested to begin with, and you should have all of those other guidances in terms of how you're training your employees and things like that. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So if you think about the healthcare workers who are at the hospital right now working with patients, they are actively enrolled in a respiratory protection program that is compliant with OSHA. We're just changing out the different devices that they're using. That's the only difference that we have there. Another question that I see here is kind of around, what is considered to be a use, changing between patients versus wearing all day long. And now, normally, under normal circumstances, we would dispose of these units after each patient interaction. Because of the shortage, though, that's one of the things that the CDC is allowing us to be able to not do, more or less, right? So that's why I'm sure you guys have seen, whether it be on LinkedIn, Facebook, social media, pictures of these healthcare professionals at the end of the day and seeing just all these marks on their faces, because they're really trying to minimize the number of uses by keeping those devices on as long as possible. I have my sister-in-law is a nurse at a hospital down in Tennessee, and she sends me a picture every day. At the end of her shift, she's been wearing the same N95 mask for 12 hours straight, and that's because they're trying to minimize the number of times that they're taking it on and off, because that does increase the contamination that they could be subject to. A couple other questions that I'm seeing here today. Can an employer force employees to wear a certain type of face cover? That's a great question. If the employer is implementing a certain type of respiratory protection as part of their respiratory protection program, where they have identified that there is a hazard present to the employee that can be addressed with that type of protection, they can mandate that because that is a requirement of the position in order to protect themselves while they are working. Other questions, let's see. We've also had some questions in terms of how do you tell if something is legitimate. You know, latest news says that we're seeing a lot of counterfeit N95 masks that are coming onto the market. How do you tell if it's legitimate? This is where I would encourage you to work with your vendors. If you are working in the industrial setting, work with your supply chain, your procurement team to try to get as much information as possible from the vendor that you're buying from. They should have documentation that says that they have gone through that FDA approval process to get that specific model of respirator into the United States for use. Let's see. Other questions that I know that have come up. You know, we talked a little bit about particle size, and that's something that comes up a lot. People who are coming to me based on research, you know, we're seeing that the size of the COVID virus is actually somewhere between 7 and 90 nanometers, right? You know, if we're looking at that 0.3 micron range for the N95, you know, how are we really protecting against something so small? You know, the thing that I always tell them to keep in mind is that, you know, the virus is not just out there, right? It's bound to something. That's how it's traveling. That's how it's infecting other people. And so in that particular instance, we're really looking at those droplets, right, that are anywhere between 5 and 10 microns, which is well within the range that an N95 is going to be able to protect against. Another question here. If we have a respiratory program, but employees are asking for respiratory protection, does Appendix D apply? That is a good question. And, you know, I kind of have to think about that one a little bit because when this pandemic first started, we actually did get guidance from OSHA that we were supposed to be recording COVID cases in the workplace on our OSHA logs, but we have since gotten guidance from them that that's not the case anymore. So, you know, typically Appendix D applies to, you know, a nuisance hazard that's in the workplace that, you know, we as a company have gone through and we've measured and we've determined that it's not a true hazard, it's more of just a comfort. But that's a good question. Michael, do you have any comments on that?
Could you repeat that again?
So we have the question of if you have a respiratory program in place, but employees are asking for respiratory protection as it pertains to COVID, does that fall under Appendix D or no, because it's not work associated?
So are we? So the question is the Appendix D pertaining to voluntary use?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, voluntary use. That's a great question. I have not had that come up yet, so I am not sure. But what we're planning to do is we will, because I know there is so many questions that have popped up here. We will get to everybody. We will get back with everybody on all these questions that we don't get to. I guess the question, my first response to that would be no. You are not required to do the basics of the fit testing. I think ultimately, as you had said earlier, OSHA is wanting you to do as much as you can to comply with the standard from OSHA's standpoint, but for you know, I think that they're making exceptions to the rule for this. That's the way my understanding is for it.
Yep, I would agree with that as well. That if it's not something that you're normally, you know, normally being exposed to or potentially exposed to in the workplace, that there is the exception to that. Filtering through some other questions that we have. Let's see here. We are using half-face respirators for certain tasks. We have an active respiratory protection program. Can I postpone fit testing until COVID settle down as long as I'm meeting other requirements? I don't really want to be fit testing at the time. So yeah, so that recent guidance that we got from OSHA does say, you know, the lingo or the phrasing that they use is that they're giving the compliance officers discretion when it comes to enforcing that particular requirement. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find a compliance officer that is, number one, actually actively going into workplaces at this time because of the pandemic, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who is going to cite you for not doing the fit testing so long as you were meeting the other requirements, knowing the shortage of the respiratory protection and the shortage of the materials and supplies needed in order to perform the fit testing.
Yes, and I would totally agree with that. I've actually talked to somebody from the OSHA consultation group here in Wisconsin, and it sounds like most OSHA people are strictly, focusing on the more serious things right now. That I think that's the least of their worries is de minimis issues regarding small components of your respiratory program. But I think in the big scheme of things, as supplies come back, we want to make sure that people are aware of that and they're preparing for the future and getting the supplies they need to get their employees set up as they start to come back to work, and what's going to be available come June and July, and start planning on that now.
Yep, absolutely. I'm seeing a couple other questions. How are we going to manage, from a school's perspectives, other businesses, what are the best way to protect staff when we come back to work? All really good questions. And I think that's all something that we're currently working through. That's definitely going to be part of what we are covering during the next webinar that Michael had mentioned when we start talking about, what are some protocols that we have to have in place. I know for the most part, many schools in the country are actually closed throughout the end of the academic year, and they'll be opening up again, hopefully for the next school year. Hopefully we have some more guidance, from that point on. But I can see for the foreseeable future, as we start to open the country back up and businesses are opening, current guidance right now, even from the White House, is that we maintain social distancing. So, how do you make sure that you maintain that 6 feet between individuals when you're working? And that can be pretty challenging depending on your industry. So definitely something to keep an eye out for that upcoming webinar, because that's definitely something that we're gonna hit. Let's see, any more questions? I know we're coming up here quick on 2, and I want to make sure that we get you guys out of here on time. I know that we've been able to capture all of our questions, so if we haven't answered what you had posted, rest assured that we will get back to you and answer those questions. But in an effort to get you guys out of here in a timely fashion and back to your day and enjoying the rest of your day. Again, I just want to thank everybody for being able to attend the webinar today. I hope you found the information valuable. As Michael mentioned, please make sure that you turn in on Thursday for our partner Hazmasters. They're going to be presenting some additional information with regards to how you can manage currently during the pandemic in your workplace to keep your employees safe. If you have any other questions, please feel free. You guys are going to get a follow-up email after this webinar with an email contact that we can definitely get you questions answered. If you have questions about product recommendations during this time, we can definitely get those for you as well. But with that, I will say thank you very much for attending. And I will turn it over to Michael if there's anything you have to add. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
That should do it. Have a good day.